Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of Enough to Keep Going, your weekly games discussion podcast here on the E2KG Network, the flagship show of the E2KG Network, back where it all started. Here with me tonight, I have along with me Mr. DBqhams. How you doing, DB? Fine, sir?
I am doing okay. I'm dealing with another flood in my basement, but I am here podcasting, so glad to be here. Feels normal.
Just to show you folks the dedication of the E2KG staff, we are here in the midst of massive infrastructure challenges. So encountering his own challenge and trying to overcome that this week is Mr. Swiss Guard. How you doing, Swiss?
Not too bad. Just we're doing some work in our house, and when you have a lot of little kids, and we've been compressed in like basically my bedroom for the last week and a half, 2 weeks, so it's a little aggravating at times.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I am your third co-host, Mr. Gascley Stamus. So tonight it is our discussion show in the rotation. So if you're not familiar, if you're not a regular watcher of the network, our gaming show setup is that we normally do so every 2 weeks on the core show on Tuesday nights at about 9:15 p.m. Eastern, we do a rolling sequence where we do a playlist discussion show 1 week, and then the following week we do a discussion topic, which is normally a super deep dive into a lot of detail. Sometimes it's a very introspective show, talking about our own perspectives on the gaming culture, living life as a gamer, living lives as grown-up gamers with responsibilities for family and homes, as you can see, as represented by our two co-hosts tonight, and jobs and everything else that kind of occupies the time that back when we were single may have normally been given over to gaming. So tonight our topic is going to be a little bit about being told the story. So games where you are kind of in more of an observation seat as far as story goes. The story is kind of delivered to you. Probably hews a little bit closer to watching a movie or watching a television show. Although I think that is one particular dynamic that we'll talk about, because there are games that are much more actually playing a movie than playing a game, versus shaping the story. So games like a Grand Theft Auto, or other games where your choices have a much larger impact, and that will probably be another decomposition of that half of the title, because again, there are games that are open worldish versus games like Mass Effect, where you are able to make a lot of choices, and your choices actually have impact on the story and as it progresses. But first, we're going to quickly go through our rapid fire playlist round. So we won't go into a deep discussion on what we've been playing. That won't formulate the bulk of our show, but we do always like to keep you guys in touch with what we're playing and how our gaming lives are progressing. So DBQ, we'll get started with you.
All right, so I have last week I was really up and high on NBA 2K18, playing that on the Switch. I went back and played around a little bit with 2K17 on PC and 16 on PS4, and my luster has decreased greatly in terms of my interest and excitement for what the franchise is doing. When you can see kind of the thread of how it hasn't changed drastically. So last week I was talking about the story mode in the MyGM and all the aspects there. And then you kind of get into the second year and it's very standard, and it's actually the exact same, and the dialogue is the exact same as it is in 16. So while I've been doing that, I've been enjoying it and telling myself, kind of creating this own narrative while I'm going. And so that's been been fun, been enjoyable, and in my second season on one of these, and made it to the playoffs, simming through. So it's been kind of fun to have that narrative. And then on the other piece, one of the other things I've been playing was the Shadow of Colossus remake. So PS4 came out 2 weeks ago or so. So in the middle of the chaos, had a little bit of time to escape to another land and hunt down some colossi. So those are the two things that I've been playing. And how about you, Swiss? What have you been playing in your chaotic world as well? Have you had a chance to play anything?
A little bit, not nearly as much as I normally do, and it's never nearly as much as I'd like. But so the first game I played some of is God of War, the PS3 remaster, and this is at your bidding, E2KG. This is my Swiss plays, and I will be reporting in on it next week, I believe. A special dual report with Prime, and I think he's doing Borderlands. But I guess my initial reaction is, oh god, QuickTime events. So that's kind of where we're going with that. The other game that I've been playing, I also picked up Shadow of the Colossus, the remake for the PS4. It was one of my all-time favorite games for the PS2, so I was really excited about playing it. I probably wasn't going to pick it up immediately, but my son had somehow dug out my old PS2 game and had shown some interest, so I went ahead and accelerated my purchase plans, and I've fought a couple of colossi, and he has fought many more, so we've been having a lot of fun with that.
That's neat and nice. I didn't think about it as a parent-child game to play together. So
yeah, he's kind of obsessed with it. So
well, if you're gonna get obsessed with something, that's definitely a classic. So yeah, that's good. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that next week on the playlist show.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. So for me, I've been playing a game called Race, the official WTCC game on PC. So that was a title released back in 2006 by one of the darlings of the driving sim gaming world, Simbin. I guess they've recently been renamed to Sector 3, which if you're not familiar with racing tracks, particularly in European circuits, are broken up into sectors. So I guess that's a play on words on the third sector of a track, which I don't know what's big about Sector 3 versus Sector 1 or Sector 2, but whatever, it's their branding. So I broke out the wheel and pedals and played a good chunk of that today, tweaked the game a little and the controls a little, because they weren't quite suited for my setup on my secondary gaming PC, but I got that wired down, so had a good bit of racing. In fact, it's the only reason technically that I put on socks and shoes today was because I need them to actually work the pedals. Playing wheel and pedals with just socks or bare feet does not work well. So it's weird that, and I actually have a pair of shoes that is kind of specifically for playing driving simulations because I need shoes for my wheel and pedals. And then I'm sorry, yeah.
Are they like authentic racing shoes? Like, did you go on eBay and get some?
No, they're a weird mix between like they're kind of like a tennis shoe, but they don't have like a thick sole, so I could feel the pedals a little bit better through my feet. But the pedals aren't really full size like car pedals. They're kind of small and skinny. So the shoes are kind of really narrow, so they really allow me to work. So
you really thought about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I knew that you would put some consideration into the not the aesthetics, but the practicality of the racing shoe.
It's not as deliberate as it sounds. It actually kind of just worked out that way. So it's more so of the shoes that I have, they are the best one for the wheel and pedals. Because one of the weird things is not weird things, but this does actually happen in racing. I am a racer, a simulated racer. I am a driver who, when I'm playing a racing game, I drive with both feet on each pedal, which there are some race car drivers that do that, but not a ton. But it allows you to do certain things with the car, which is basically to actually use the brakes and the accelerator to kind of create oversteer on the back end of the car, and kind of slew the car around the track. So I do that, and it's actually part of my steering input, not just throttle control. So, but yeah, so I had a lot of fun playing that today, because I've been home with off and on with my kid who's been sick. So
I'm impressed. I'm impressed about the dual steering and you've really, not only have you thought about it, but I mean there is a technical reason for this setup. So yeah, certainly impressed.
I've been playing racing sims for a very long time. So I guess about 17, 18 years actually. So and then I switched over to the Nintendo Switch and played some Super Bomberman R, which my report out on that is I just don't get like the purpose of that game. So like there are challenge levels where it's like defeat all enemies, but there's no time limit. So I'm like, I don't know. It's a thing. So I played that today, and I'll be playing a little bit of Legend of Zelda later. So DBQ, you're the one who kind of set us up with this topic. I did my best to try and formulate and decompose and sub-bulletize your concept, but I probably didn't do that great an idea. So regardless of whatever we have in the agenda, I want to throw it to you and let you pitch this to kick us off.
Sure, yeah. So I guess I'll kind of set it up and kind of where it came from, right? I mean, this is not a new topic. I think at one point in time in our previous show, we've covered a similar topic, but it feels, at a time when there's not a huge number of big releases right now, but there are some that are, holding people's interest, right? Or some that are not successful holding people's interest. So things like at the end of last month with Monster Hunter, and while the reports are that the story mode is pretty good, what usually people end up, what people are talking about on podcasts is the narrative that they end up creating because of the hunt, right? That they were hunting down the specific beast and it, burrowed into a different part of the map and they needed to chase it down, and there's a story that goes along with it, right? Other than, just like in Destiny 1, there were stories about how you got a certain gun or took down a certain boss. Yeah, and I think part of this was the dichotomy over the past weekend. Gasicles and myself, we were playing some Destiny 2 on PC and kind of chipping our way through the story mode. And so it's the multiple times that both of us have played through it, at least twice now, and kind of really thinking about, right, it's that action ride and how much, agency do we have over the character that doesn't speak, that doesn't really do anything, that it kind of just gets pulled on a string through a story, similar to like a Call of Duty, right? That if you got to keep progressing forward, otherwise those enemies are going to keep respawning as well. So thinking about kind of that division of storytelling, right? That is it something where we reshape the game, like my NBA 2K story, or is it something where there is a story that's told to us? And part of that is to see, what do we find ourselves playing? Do we feel like, at some point I feel like I switched from wanting the story told to me to having a more agency in it, right? And having the ability to kind of shape that in a Mass Effect or Dragon Age type of way. And so I'm curious if you guys find yourself leaning one way or the other, or if there's a balance, that you can appreciate both, or where you find yourself on that topic. So I'm going to toss it back to you, Aglasicles. So, we're talking about the potential of story and what else they could have done in Destiny 2. I know that you've picked up Monster Hunter, but you haven't really had a chance to dive into that. You also started Mass Effect on the PC recently. And so I'm curious, after playing both the original Mass Effect, which is kind of janky and old, but potentially has some agency, versus bright and shiny Destiny 2, which just pulls you on a string. Where do you find enjoyment in each of those, or do you find yourself stuck in the headspace of one versus the other?
So it's a tough question, right? Like I guess I'll start off and say I don't know. I think part of what we're going to do in this 30-45 minute discussion is discover a little bit about ourselves and talking through this, because I don't, man, there's a lot of things that are very adjacent to it that get wrapped up, right? And I know one of those for me is this this factor that I call like the guaranteed entertainment factor, right? I've got 30 minutes to game. I need to know that I'm going to get something accomplished in that time frame, right? So Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, right? I played like a few minutes earlier tonight, but when I start Zelda, I don't know that I'm going to get anything done in 30 minutes, right? Of any significance. I boot up a game like Race, the WTCC game, and I know that I'm at least going to get some calibration or some performance checks done, and I'm going to be prepped for like the next race, or I'm going to do a race and I'm going to get something done. Super Bomberman R, short levels, small kind of tactical puzzle piece, set pieces. So I got a number of things done, 4, 5, 6 levels completed, but I don't know that was particularly satisfying, right? So I get all over the place. But to go back to your comment about Destiny versus Mass Effect, Destiny 2, no, it's not letting me create a story. But one of the things I love about Destiny is when I sit down, I kind of know that I'm going to get something done, right? And a lot of it's very mechanical, and it's not very story based. My character continues to grow and develop, but it's not the same thing as character development in terms of a Mass Effect. So that fun quotient, that speed to market of fun delivery, right, is a thing that I kind of focus on, and it gets tied in and muddled with this concept of create a story versus play through a story. Half-Life 2 I recently completed, and if you guys remember, there was a point in game design where there was a lot of discussion about gamers don't really care about story, right? And I guess it was this effort to kind of knock Half-Life and the franchise down a peg. After its kind of rise to the top, particularly in the first-person shooter area. But I stuck with that game because it had a story to it, right? And I eventually wanted to see that completed. It wasn't a burning thing that I had to complete, but I wanted to see it through. So I'm kind of all over the map. Infamous Second Son is another game that I've been playing recently, where that's kind of a mix of both, right? And for a long time, I really haven't gotten the whole open world, third-person action-adventure game. It's kind of been lost on me. Largely because I felt like I didn't want the responsibility of creating the story, right? I didn't want to have to look at a map and say, well, there's 9 things I can do. Some of them I need to do from a skill and mechanical standpoint, but some of them I need to do for story. There was a point in my gaming life I didn't want that responsibility, right? I'm like, you tell me what sequence you want me to play through them in. So I don't know. Maybe I'm not the best person to first stake a claim.
No, I think as you're talking about that, right, I find myself thinking about different times in my life when I've been that kind of checklist gamer, right? Like I know that I only have a certain period of time and I want to go in and feel productive. Right? Destiny 1 certainly did that. The Borderlands series, right, that you could go in and grind out a few levels and walk away without feeling like you accomplished something. Where I think this would be an interesting piece, and I'll kick it over to you, Swiss, with this, is your example of Zelda is one of the big reasons why I ended up bouncing off of Zelda, is that I didn't have the time to kind of commit to really seeing some progress, where you didn't level, there wasn't necessarily any stat gain that was happening, and so when I would sit down, if I came back to it, or it wasn't a game that I could kind of peck away at. So Swiss, I know that you've played, Zelda, and you've played a number of other games. I think Shadow of Colossus also kind of falls in this way, where it's very much telling us a story. And do you have time to, is it sitting down and churning out one Colossi, or, I'm curious on where you find yourself in either that idea of narrative, but also kind of how much time you can devote and what that means for what experience you're looking for.
For me, it's interesting that you guys brought up the time constraint, because I hadn't really reflected on that, maybe not consciously, but I did think, as far as, say, The Legend of Zelda was concerned, Breath of the Wild has definitely been my least played Zelda in quite some time. Just because, I guess, like you said, it's so open-ended. You have the shrines. That's what I found myself gripping to, which was, okay, I'm in this region. I want to quote conquer the region. Conquer is probably not the best term, but I found myself kind of trying to methodically pour over a region to find all the shrines that at a given time I could accomplish. And there was little motivation there because you gain spirit orbs, which you can exchange for heart containers and additional hearts or stamina, but it didn't really drive the narrative as much. Not that Zelda's a heavily narrative-based game, but I've never been one to just enjoy a pure grind. Like I don't understand just games that are just about grind for loot, repeat. So I would say that I definitely lean towards more being told a story. So, and part of that is just, I guess it helps for motivation. The other part is, I would almost categorize it as my OCD. So if I think back in the day, do you remember the original Knights of the Old Republic? And that was RPG by BioWare. That was pretty exciting. One, it was Star Wars. Two, you had the whole thing where you could, based on your actions, you were either light side or dark side, and you could influence your party kind of a little bit, and the game kind of evolved based on what you did. And that was cool. But I found myself frequently rebooting or resetting or whatever, and going back and just trying to see what the other branches of the game would have afforded. I ended up, following a certain path, but I would peck and reset and go back and see what I was missing. And perhaps this also ties back into time. I don't have time to play the same game 5 times to see every experience that the developers conceived from the game. I generally play it once and that's it. So that kind of, that replayability factor, I kind of like the fact that with the game where I'm being told a story, I know I'm getting the experience, the prime experience the developers intended. So with Horizon Zero Dawn, yeah, I have a lot of flexibility in how I tackle it, but I know when I hit these certain quest points, I'm getting the story that they've established.
So this is a thing where, like, what I'm getting out of listening to you guys go through this is I'm having to remind myself the lessons of the last couple of years when we've like tracked our own time and things, and I've had to come back and admit some things to myself that align to the data that I'm seeing, even though it's not necessarily what I might be inclined to talk about from an emotional space. If I go back to last year, I wouldn't have said that Destiny 2, when we did our superlatives, I wouldn't have said that Destiny 2 would have jumped to my foremind as the best game of last year. But one of the things I had to admit when I sat down and looked at the data, I was like, yeah, dude, but that's where you spend a significant chunk of your time, right? Like, so, DB and I have talked about these games where there's not a story inherent in the game, or there's not a strong narrative inherent in the game, but he and I kind of create a story in our minds, right? When we've talked about this in sports games, and some other things, and years where I've spent a ton of time like grinding away in like Forza Horizon 3. And what I realized, like I said, going through this discussion, at least partially, is that that is probably the type of game that I glom onto the most. Again, it doesn't jump to my foremind as being representative of like the better of the design type, but there was a time in my gamer life where, like you said, DB, last weekend, was it Destiny 2 you were talking about that gave you kind of like that just one more turn kind of feel, but it wasn't in a like turn-based strategy genre?
Oh no, it was the NBA 2K series when I was simming a franchise.
Right, and so there was a time that I felt that way about games with strong narrative, like Metal Gear Solid. I stayed up till very late hours of the morning because I just wanted to see like the next kind of dialogue oriented kind of cutscene, right, or the nearest equivalent to it that we had back in the Metal Gear Solid days. Max Payne was kind of the same way. Like I just wanted to see like the next thing, but I don't think that I don't think that I hook into games anymore where I'm just playing to get to the next cutscene. So I would definitely say, at least for the time being, the games that provide me a playground kind of framework that I might build my own story out of are probably the ones that I cling to most strongly. And maybe that makes me aligned to what Swiss mentioned, where he doesn't understand the games where you just grind. If there's a reason to grind, I don't mind. It's got to be the right thing. Like there are games that I don't like to grind. Like I don't play Grand Theft Auto. Because I'm not into that kind of a grind, but I definitely play Destiny and Destiny 2, and racing games, right? And a lot of that is just grinding through, to play additional instances of what is pretty much the same type of playground kind of skill set exhibition.
Well,
So I'm gonna go ahead, Swiss.
I was gonna say, when I hear you say that with regards to racing games, I think skill is the operative word. So I wouldn't say you're just grinding. I would maybe I don't really have a great definition for grind, but like to me, when you're playing like a racing game, you're improving your abilities as you play. You're challenging yourself against the obstacles that the game has presented. I just like when I think about grinding, I think about RPGs where it's just a matter of like you fight hordes of enemies to gain some loot boxes, to get a slightly, improved weapon, to fight slightly improved hordes of enemies. So it feels like the challenge is artificial, but when you're playing a racing game, it feels different. Like I played a lot of when after Gascles turned me onto it, Need for Speed, Hot Pursuit, I think was the one that we played a lot of. And I remember going through and just trying to unlock everything. And it was because I could feel my skill improving and I wanted to shave a few more seconds off. And there was a self-motivating factor there. And it felt different from just a pure, it didn't feel like an artificial carrot. Like it felt like the game was like, here's our structure. You try to master this. And to me, that's a little bit different from just, putting you on a treadmill, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you said, Aglasicles, about the GTA, right? That you talk about it as a grind game or as a narrative game where there's choice, but to me that's been where I've always fallen off of the modern GTAs, is that there's not choice, and there's not, your character is your character. You don't level up, there's not a skill tree, so I'm going through these missions and what's the award? Basically just progressing the story forward. And so that's been one of the, this is the grind potentially that you're talking about, Swiss, where I guess similar to a racing game where GTA, the reward is improving your skill, right? The same is probably true in some first-person shooters that are online, right? Or in Prime's case with PUBG, that the grind, the reward of the grind is skill, not necessarily unlocking a new gun like in Call of Duty. As I'm thinking about this, and I going to kind of divert the topic here a little bit, and as I think about the grind versus the narrative experience, one of the things that I as I'm thinking about games that have done this for me, is I think about the time in my life when the narrative game has been what I've pursued, and where the grind game has been a comfort food, right? So I can point to times when I've spent, hundreds of hours in Destiny 1 or 256 hours on my Steam clock for Borderlands 2 as a time when necessarily life was not the greatest. And that the checklist game, the grind aspect of that in maybe a frustration in my workplace, I found comfort in progressing the needle forward in terms of moving the numbers. Where if I think about times when I've really dove into a narrative game, something like the first Walking Dead, or playing through Spec Ops: The Line twice to try different endings, it's been a time and a place where I was satisfied in other places, and so I was looking for that entertainment experience. So I guess this is a complex question, right? That sometimes it's about the game, it's about the narrative, it's about what's rewarding. Is it the skill, or is it the the spreadsheet? And I don't know if there is a good clear answer, and probably that's why it makes for a good discussion, because ideally we all have different answers at different times in our gaming careers about this.
Can I ask you a question about GTA, DB?
Sure.
So how do you feel about the gameplay itself? Because you said that you kind of feel constrained by the story. My thought when I was kind of thinking about how I viewed this, and Zeus Agascles mentioned Metal Gear Solid, which is also one of my all-time favorite games. But we all know that Hideo Kojima will spend inordinate amounts of time on cutscenes. So, I mean, in some ways you can be like, man, am I just watching his movie? But the gameplay was so much fun for me. Like, I love the stealth gameplay. I love the sense of humor in both the gameplay and in the cutscenes. That, yes, the cutscenes were a motivating factor, but I didn't feel like I was just spinning or just, spinning my wheels to get to the next cutscene. It felt like when I was playing the game, I was still accomplishing something and having a good time with the gameplay. So does GTA, for example, is it just, are you bored with the formula, and then the cutscenes the story no longer can, it just feels more burdensome because there's nothing there to support it?
So I guess I'll answer that by a couple of comparisons where I guess in the modern GTAs, both Nico and in GTA 4 and the 3 characters in GTA 5, I wish that there was the ability to make some choices, to be able to have some paths for your characters. I think the reason that I fall off of those games is that I end up not caring about the character. Where Solid Snake, for all the goofiness that is, Kojima's world, I still am interested in what happens to him as a character, and the wacky cast of clones and everything else that come along with it. In some ways, the goofiness of a Saints Row game ends up hooking me more than GTA, because the characters are a little self-effacing. They don't take themselves so seriously. It's not trying to be a Scorsese movie, so it's that idea. I think it's also, I'd be interested when we get to next week as well, right? Thinking about God of War, that the gameplay for me was always more interesting than Kratos as a character, right? That what do they do that makes me care about the character, and why do I keep engaging with that if I'm looking for that narrative type of game? So that's on the narrative side. So on the kind of make your own narrative side, whether that's grinding through, not or grinding, but playing through the Need for Speed or Forza, where do you find yourself making those narratives in other games as you go along? So I guess, please.
For me, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Swiss. If you had an answer to that, I was just going to direct that a little bit more.
I was going to say, where do I find myself developing the narrative? And usually in those, for lack of a better term, skill-based motivation games type things, it's all I can think about is like the Pokemon song, I want to be the very best, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more just like when I'm playing the game, I can, and I'm, for example, a police officer. I want to be able to take down like the guy as fast as possible. And so the objective very much coincides with my motivation of trying to be the best, most slick cock there is, and or trying to be the cool guy that gets away and uses my weapons to the best effect. So it's more that the game supports me as supports my ego. Let's put it that way. Those skills-based games support my ego, and as a skilled driver or cop or whatever, or if I'm playing Splatoon 2, an inkling, there's not a lot of story there, but the skill progression supports my ego and how I perceive myself as a quote awesome gamer. Very quoted.
So
Very quoted.
I think Swiss makes a good point, and I think DB, you've brought up this topic of like games that are highly streamable, right? And as Swiss was starting to talk through that, I was starting to come around through another realization, which is since I've gotten so much into recording my gameplay these days, recording the unfolding of a story that's being delivered to you isn't that interesting. It is a little, but I will say, I have probably leaned more towards it, and I'm not necessarily saying that the live streaming and the game capturing have begotten this type of gameplay that attracts me, or if the type of gameplay that I'm attracted to has begotten, the intention to live stream and game capture. But a lot of the games that I play, when I talk about the grind, and I understand it's maybe not how Swiss intended it, or at least it's not the offensive style of grinding that Swiss doesn't care for. A lot of it is very experiential, and it's not seeing the story unfold is very much akin to, like I said, watching a TV show or watching a movie. The experiential part of it involves you mechanically interacting with the game. There's not a narrative that's in my head when I walk away from Race, the WTCC game, in the same way that there was that narrative that we talked about on the one episode where I played multiple seasons of Madden right on my PlayStation 2, right, where I had this rookie that I had recruited and I was a head coach, and when I play Madden, like, I only coach teams in towns that I would actually like to live in, right? So that's like and there's a little bit of an imagining of me being a head coach with a really palatial estate, right, in a town that I would like to go back to. But there is this sense, like Swiss was mentioning, of the joy and the experiences in my own progression and my own skill set at conquering or surmounting a given game instantiated obstacle, knocking down a race. So in race today, I started a 10 race season, and it's 10 laps, and I have it set for 10 laps per race. That's 20 minutes in a race. That's a significant amount of time in a race. That's not 3 laps in Forza, right? And a lot can happen during that race. I pushed myself too hard in the first career race today and threw myself off the track and wound up like in 8th place after leading for several laps, and I had to regain those positions. And I had 2 guys who were fighting in front of me, so I had to get around those 2 knuckleheads. And then fortunately, the next part, they were all clumped together in a pack, right? So I was like, I just need to get past this one pack. But that narrative only existed in the game. But a lot of it was living mechanically in the here and now, interfacing with my wheel and pedals, and I do that a lot with the peripherals that I play with. And a lot of it is just playing a game to see the next crazy thing happen, right? Because when I live stream or I game capture, that's what makes those sequences that I've recorded, I guess, unique and attractive to people watching them. They watch them to see what craziness is going to ensue. And so while Grand Theft Auto is probably attractive for that reason as well, Grand Theft Auto, for me, mechanically doesn't feel good when you play it from a mechanical perspective. Destiny 2 does. Just Cause 3 does, once you conquer some of the weirdness of the control interface. So a lot of it, to me, I love racing because you know, in a car collection style game like Forza Horizon 3 or the Forza Motorsport series, because I race, I accumulate cash, I buy new cars, and when I put that new car on the track and I'm racing against a different class or whatever of vehicles, what craziness might ensue is inherently changed by, granted, a fixed set of variables, but because those variables are always different every time I interact with the game, that's what makes those things experiential and attractive to me. And so I don't need as much as the narrative, and this is where I talk a lot about Destiny 2. Say what you want about Destiny 2 story, mechanically, it's arguably the best first-person shooter that I've ever played, and all I need is, I just need give me, it's what I always say about racing games, right? Don't give me a story or a bunch of contrived gaminess, right? Just give me a bunch of cars and give me a bunch of tracks and let me change up those variables as I so please and let me play the game.
Yeah, that idea of giving you the sandbox and just letting you go ahead and play it, right? That's a different experience, because then you can bring to that what you want at the moment, whether you want the narrative of the career that you're creating, or you want the streamable unpredictability of careening off the track. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of, you know, what makes a good streamable game. And I think that the numbers on Twitch and other places show that out, right? That, you know, you're not seeing the stream of story-driven heavy games, because basically what happens there is pretty consistent throughout each gamer's experience. You know, you may end up being able to do a speed run in some cases, but other than that, the path through that game is very similar. Where in something where you do have that big sandbox, or there is the, you know, here's the tool set to just go and play, and that's going back to Zelda of Breath of the Wild, right? That's another place where it is a streamable game because of the wackiness that can happen with the world sandbox that they gave you. And so yeah, I think that's a key piece in terms of kind of the current kind of not only gaming trends, but just kind of the potential of what's out there, of and we see this play out in the financials, right? We can't go a show without talking about financials, but we see that play out in the financials as well, of, you know, the single player narrative driven story that's a one and done is, you know, this is where EA got a lot of flack last fall about creating that doesn't you know, create better long-term engagement for gamers, right? To use financial speak. But I think that, you know, those are things that not only gamers are thinking about, but publishers and creators are thinking about as well. So yeah, I guess you know, I think there's a lot here to keep chewing on. So I want to kick it back over to you, Swiss, to see if you have any other final thoughts before we get close to our time period here.
We had kind of briefly touched on Shadow of the Colossus as an example, and I was curious whether, I think you had mentioned in the chat client that it was actually the story is a demotivational factor for you. I'd always felt in that game that the story was very light, and I want to save my beloved, and for me it was always about, can I defeat the next Colossus? And so it never has been, the story never really drove me in that game. So, you know, I guess in a way that's what we would call, what are we calling that? The challenge, or the ego driven, you know, conquest type. So what, without getting too much into the game, because I know we want to talk about it, you know, in our play segment next week, what is it about the story that is demotivational for you?
So I guess when I played it back on the PlayStation 2, I kind of knew what the end game was, and kind of I was spoiled by it, not in a bad way, but my motivation for saving my friend, girlfriend, lover, whatever, was not nearly as great as I progressed through the game and had hints of the darker tones that the game was going toward. And so there came, and it happened to me again in the remake, where I love the gameplay, but narratively, I I want to stop playing because I don't want to see that ending, right? So there's a whole nother piece there of headcanon where, yes, okay, no matter what happens, this is still the game that they're trying to tell, and it's a powerful game. It also, because of its power, is it's like a tearjerker drama. Do I want to engage in that at a certain period of time, or do I have to be in the right mood to play that? So
No, I totally
that's my
get that.
rationale.
More from like movies. Like when I have the time to sit down and watch a movie, I don't want to get depressed. So we won't go into spoilers for Shadow of the Colossus, I guess. If any of you out there have never played the old PS2 game or you haven't beaten the PS4, but yeah, it's not exactly the happiest of endings. But I mean, I would say that it does end with a silver lining, but we'll see. In a way.
See, there we go. There's a good way to wrap up the discussion as well. So we've got some teases for next week's conversation of our playlist. So, Agastocles, any final thoughts on this topic as we head into the final segments?
Yeah, and I apologize. I'll try and get through this quick. It might not be quick though. Sorry, because I don't want to sell short the notion of the single player linear highly narrative game. I think there's a good way to do that. I think where a lot of games fall down this morning is this morning. Wow, I think where a lot of games fall down these days that are designed in that style are falling prey to the Titanic factor, right? Meaning that much like many movies feel like they have to be 2.5 hours long today to be a highly financially successful movie, or to contend for an Oscar. Some games today feel like they have to be like 40 hours of gameplay. And my problem with the single player narrative is I would like to get single player linear games that never go into my backlog, right? Because they're 8 to 16 hour stories, right? I don't want a 40-hour story that lingers around in my backlog for years. So that's one thing. By the same token, as we're still kind of coming through award season, because I guess DICE is in March, or is very, very late this month, one of the two.
Yeah, no, the GDC you're talking about, right?
Or the DICE Award.
Oh, the DICE Award, yes. They're coming up. Horizon Zero Dawn got a ton of nominations for it. Yeah.
Right, and so HCD is a good example. But by the same token, like, I feel like Assassin's Creed Origins has gotten snubbed much more so than Horizon Zero Dawn did. I think Assassin's Creed Origins is one of the best designed games in terms of having a very strong narrative through a strong linear chord, but where there's tons of side missions and tons of discovery and tons of things to do that aren't written in what I call the Morrowind style, right? Where side missions were really a big distraction and detraction from you getting through the mainline story piece. So if I guess Origins to me is kind of the culmination of the best in class of third person action adventure open world kind of game design that we've seen evolving over the last few years. And it really nails it and gets it right, both in terms of tone and pacing. In terms of side missions aren't 2 to 4 hour events, right? They're kind of neatly packaged little 5 to 10 minute missions that if you want to grind through 3 or 4 of those in a sitting, you can. They're all incredibly well structured, and they don't feel like a mainline story piece. So I think there's a right way to do those things. I think they occur fewer and farther between these days than your larger kind of open world grindy, highly mechanical with a prescribed set of variables type of gameplay that's offered in a lot of games. Both are good. They just need to be tailored properly to fit within the lifestyle, I guess, for each of us, particularly in this phase of our lives where, like I said, we have a lot of other things that we have to do. And so when it comes game time, right, we have a certain set amount of time to get a certain amount of things done and experienced.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about just our gameplay in general, right? In terms of there are, limits on our time, and our desires are boundless. And so trying to find a way to balance those two. And I completely am on that same page about a nice 8 to 10 hour story driven game. Last year I had a blast kind of quickly churning through things like the Titanfall 2 or even the Call of Duty Infinite Warfare campaign, right? So those are 5-6 hour affairs. They're not huge, but they were satisfying little narrative stories where, I'll be honest, I really enjoy an Uncharted game, but I always feel like I could do with it being a little shorter and tighter. And I think that's one of the things that kind of played out in Uncharted Lost Legacy this past year with the different characters. And it was a 10-hour game that there were critics who were kind of, definitely singing its praises because it was tightly focused, right? That it doesn't need to live for 3 weeks in my gaming life if it's telling me something where I can actually feel connected and see that story through and not have to kind of recall what happened 3 weeks ago to put the narrative thread back together. So yeah, I'm good with kind of wrapping this up. I'll be curious, maybe this is something that as we tie back in over the next couple of months, as we think about what we're playing and why we're playing it, maybe this is something we come back to in terms of why we chose what we chose, whether that was something that was on our list or because emotionally or, something struck us about that was the type of game that we needed to put on our driving shoes and put the pedals down and enjoy that on a day that you were home and couldn't get out into the rest of the world. So yeah. So any final thoughts, gentlemen?
When you say it's how we feel emotionally, what we want to play, all I can think about is George Costanza with like 6 suitcases saying, "I dress according to mood."
Well, now we'll have to look and see what Swiss is wearing next time to see what his mood is for the evening, as we're all in black tonight. So, okay, well, let's head off into our final segment here. I'll kick it back over to you, Agasicles.
Yeah, and I don't think we have a final segment this week because we're not reporting out and we're not gearing up with a selection for anybody for next week. So, unless you guys have anything. All right. Well, thanks very much for joining us for tonight's Deep Discussion podcast. Next week will be a gamer experience episode. Will it still be February next week? It will still be February next week. So it'll be our bottom half of February gamer experience show. As Swiss mentioned, we will be reporting out on 2 of our co-hosts having played God of War Remastered, as well as a little bit of going back and revisiting Borderlands. And then we'll be teeing up DBQ for our DBQ plays and what his gaming assignment will be for the 2 weeks after that. So
the last thing I'll say is I think the 2 kind of report outs tie in nicely with our topic tonight, right? That Borderlands, battling a big squishy blob that comes out at the end of the vault is not necessarily a strong narrative driven game. It very much is that grindy type of game where God of War is very narrative driven and propels you along oftentimes linear corridors. So we've got a little bit of both coming out of our discussion from tonight to talk about next week.
Yep, absolutely. So on behalf of myself from the E2KG network, this has been Agasically Samus, DBqhams, Swiss Guard. Thanks so much for joining in. Please join us right back here next week, Tuesday night, approximately 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time, for our Gamer Experience show to close out the month of February. That's going to do it for us for tonight. Thanks so much for joining in. We are out of here.